The Basement Room is a scary tale about a family who experience a weird and disturbing supernatural presence in their cellar. Years ago, my family went on a vacation in Cape Cod, and we rented a small old house to stay in for 2 weeks. On the main floor was the kitchen, the living room, and a bathroom. The bedrooms were on the second floor. There was a basement room downstairs with a washer and dryer, a sofa, and a television. On the first night, we were all awakened by a terrible scream from my sister's bedroom. When my dad burst into her room and turned on the light, he found her sitting up in bed, screaming and crying. My parents sat with her and comforted her until she finally calmed down enough to tell them what had scared her. She said that she had been awakened in the middle of the night by a horrible stench. When she opened her eyes, she had seen the entire bedroom soaked in blood from top to bottom. There was blood all over the floor, bloody handprints on the walls, and blood spatter all over the ceiling. We all thought that she had just been having a nightmare, but she refused to go back into her bedroom and stayed in our parents' room for the remainder of the holiday. One evening, my mother was cooking dinner in the kitchen upstairs, and my father had gone out on an errand in a nearby town. My sister and I were in the basement room, watching TV, when all of a sudden, the light bulb popped and the TV went off, leaving us in complete darkness. The basement was unfinished and had old stone walls, making it a bit of a creepy place. For a few seconds we just froze, not knowing what to do. Then we started to smell something horrible. It was a terrible stench, and when it hit our noses, we felt nauseous. It smelled like rotting flesh. The smell quickly grew worse, and then we just heard a scratching in the darkness. Something seemed to be scratching at the floor or the walls. We screamed and began scrambling around in the pitch black, trying to find the door. Eventually, we managed to open the door and ran upstairs screaming to our mother. We kept telling her about the disgusting smell, and we heard something scratching and scraping around down there. My mother eventually agreed to go down to the basement, replace the bulb, and check out the source of the horrible smell. She took a flashlight and a new bulb and disappeared into the darkened basement as we waited for her at the top of the stairs. We expected her to return quickly, but she seemed to be down there for an eternity. Suddenly, we saw her emerge out of the darkness and come running up the stairs. She slammed the basement door behind her and bolted it as fast as she could. She turned to us, and we could see her face had completely drained of color. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she just said, "I don't want you going down there again." Then she went into the kitchen and called the police. We overheard her conversation on the phone and managed to figure out that she'd seen someone down in the basement room. As we waited for the police to come, we huddled together in the living room, staring at the basement door. At any moment, we expected to hear someone banging on it or trying to break it down. My mother refused to tell us what she had seen. When the police arrived, my mother greeted them at the front door and ushered them inside. She unbolted the basement door, and they went down into the darkness with their flashlights out and their guns drawn. They searched the entire basement room, but found nothing. There was no other way out of the basement. No windows, no doors. Whatever was down there would have had to come up through the basement door. After the police left, my mother finally revealed what she had seen down there in the pitch-black basement room. As she spoke, she became very still and quiet. She said that she had been changing the light bulb downstairs when she began to smell the horrible stench we had described to her. Then she started to hear a faint scratching noise. She shone her flashlight around the room and suddenly caught sight of something crouched between the washer and dryer. It was a man, crouched on all fours. His clothes were tattered, his hair was wild and tangled, and his face didn't look human. It was twisted in an expression of pure hatred. In that split second, he looked up at my mother, his eyes reflecting the beam from her flashlight. Then he suddenly crawled forward and disappeared through a wall. When my mother saw him simply vanish into thin air, she dropped the flashlight and ran. After that, none of us would go down in the basement. We kept the door locked and bolted. Every night we slept in our parents' room and locked that door too. We cut our holiday short a few days later and just drove home. I was called to work to clean a junk dealer's house. The basement looked like it was an insane asylum that a serial killer had moved into. Animal skins hanging from the ceiling, old-fashioned sewing machines, newspapers covering the windows and clippings of certain people, glass jars filled with something, stacks of wet mattresses, old-style bed frames, a few rats, mold. When we were kids, my friends and I broke into an abandoned haunted house. It was in the typical abandoned haunted house state, with some old furniture and other household junk. When we went down to the basement, there were no light bulbs, so only natural daylight came through the small windows. It was dark, but we could still see around. We didn't search for long because a piano started playing, which we couldn't see. We ran out of the house, and although I didn't see it, a couple of friends saw someone in an upstairs window as we ran back into the woods. As I was typing this, I wondered for the first time if the house was completely abandoned and someone living there decided to fuck with us instead of getting angry. Despite this, I was scared for several days. It was a cold Friday afternoon, and I was walking home after going to the bar across the street from my house with my friends. They all lived on the other side of the bar, so I was walking alone. It had recently started to get dark around 5, and it was 10, so as you can imagine, it was dark. My street didn't have any street lamps since it wasn't a popular one. Me and my boyfriend moved in about a month ago. The house was cheap, and said to me haunted by a little girl that used to live there. I personally don't believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't. My boyfriend did, but said, "What harm can a little girl be?" and bought it anyway. I turned the corner and walked onto our street. Some of the neighbors called my name and waved me up to the porch. They were a really nice elderly couple named Bian and Chi. We talked for a bit about the raccoons and our neighbor Ngai's missing cat. After a while, it got even later, and we all went back inside our houses. When I opened the door, I thought I saw my boyfriend, Hui's face. I knew it was impossible since he was in Utah taking care of his mother who had fallen ill the week before. I closed the door, took off my shoes, and went to our room. For a split second, I thought I saw him sitting on the bedside crying into his palms. I brushed it off and changed, then got into bed. I had the strangest dream about being mother to the little girl who said to haunt the house. "Lynn!" I walked into the room where I heard my husband's voice. He was holding her body in shock. "Tu Yen." The voice didn't belong to me, and I had no control. I sat up soaked in sweat. That day, I learned that Hui had died in a car crash from Utah to Washington State. I am forever convinced that I saw my boyfriend's ghost and that he was trying to tell me that in my dreams. I bought a very old house. The prior owner was born in and died in the house at age 97. He had been in bad health and rather senile before he died, so my house was in bad shape and very dirty. One day, I was in the small, strange, poorly lit shelf basement cleaning up. I was in a dark corner looking at some stuff and trying to decide what to do with it when I glanced up and saw a brown curved thing hanging from the joists. It was about 4 feet by 4 feet and a foot thick or more. My first thought was that it was a pod like in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I got a flashlight and took a close look and realized it was much worse. It was the biggest wasp nest I had or have ever seen. I ran out and tried to figure out what to do. After some thought, I realized I had not seen wasps in the basement or the house, so it was most likely empty. So, I cautiously and carefully removed it with as little destruction as possible. The outside was a beautiful, fragile, paper-like structure with a marbled pattern. I was able to save a piece that was about 12x18x10. I still have it hanging in my studio. This actually happened last night. I woke up and saw my dog scratching himself on the floor next to my bed. I called his name and told him to get on the bed, but he just sat there scratching. I called out to him again and again. He just sat there, scratching his head furiously. I used a sterner voice, hoping to get his attention. Suddenly, my dog walked out from under the bed and sat in front of the scratching dog. He was completely oblivious to his doppelganger. I just laid there frozen, staring at my dog and what could only be explained as the creature from The Thing. What felt like minutes passed, and then, suddenly, the scratching dog just fucking vanished. That's when I remembered all the caffeine I drank in the evening and how it triggers my sleep-related hallucinations. I called to my, hopefully, real dog, and he hopped up on the bed and laid next to me. I struggled to fall back asleep, thankful I didn't have a full-blown episode of sleep paralysis. I used to do social service at a hospital here in Mexico as part of my computer science degree requirements. Most of the time, we were doing little tasks like cleaning computers or checking the internet, the boring jobs the actual workers didn't want to do. One day, the manager wanted us to change the cables located in the basement, so 2 other students and I went down the basement with ladders to remove and replace all the old Ethernet cable. Now, the thing about hospitals in Mexico is that as long as the infrastructure works, it's the same decade after decade, no renovations, and it shows. The basement, while well lit and clean, was really old. So, we were assigned a different hall and started with the job. About 2 hours into it, one of the students came running, looking mortified, and asked me what's wrong. I just looked confused and asked him what he meant, and he said he heard a man yelling for help and thought I had had an accident. We checked with the other student and she said that she hadn't heard anything. We finished the job and told the manager about it later. He just said, "Oh, you met the basement ghost." It was winter. There was a strong wind blowing outside and it was freezing. My friend and I were 14 years old. Some 14-year-old girls showed off new things and dated guys, but we were not in that category. We always wanted adventure. We often went to abandoned sites or simply traveled. My friend lived in an old house where on the ground floor there was an entrance to the basement. As you enter the entrance, there is a door immediately. One fine day we discovered that our apartment keys fit the basement door. It was new but unreliable. They opened the door, walked in, turned on the light. They began to walk further, but there was no light there. This did not upset us, so we turned on the flashlight, which we always had with us, and moved on. The basement was dark, creepy, with rotting cell doors. Half of the cells were either locked or boarded up. After exploring the basement, we went home. This is how we first entered this basement, but that's not the most interesting thing. A few days later, we set up our cell. They began to come there often, and one day, we were very noisy, and suddenly, footsteps began to be heard. They became louder as if they were getting closer to us. Naturally, there was an idea that the tenant of the house heard the noise and decided to drive away the one who climbed into the basement. We began to pretend that we were walking with a flashlight and looking for a cell with pickles. But then, when we approached the source of the noise, the steps suddenly stopped. After this incident, there were many more strange things. For example, we went in and slammed the basement door. We sat quietly, then went out, and the door was open. When you open it, it's very audible throughout the entire entrance and basement. Or, for example, there was a feeling that there was someone in the basement, but we walked around the entire basement and there was no one. When we heard footsteps for the last time, we couldn't stand it and quickly left the basement. But there was something that made us need to go back. We forgot our big flashlight. It was my friend's father's, and if something happens to it, it will fly to us. I always have a small flashlight with me, but we didn't have enough light, so we took my father's. Upon arriving home, my friend told my dad that she had forgotten the lantern from me and would pick it up tomorrow. We couldn't buy it in the store because we had no money, so the next day we decided to pick him up. So, armed with a small flashlight, a prayer against evil spirits and our fearlessness, we went to the basement. We go in, close the door, and move on. There is no light there, so I turn on the flashlight. In the dim light of a flashlight, I read a prayer from a piece of paper and my friend goes to our cell. When she grabbed the lantern, the prayer fell right out of my hand. I don't know how it happened, and at the same moment a loud knock was heard from another cell and footsteps from the end of the basement. We were so scared that we ran out without looking. They turned off the lights and locked the basement. Later, after this incident, we often heard footsteps, and the door was sometimes open on its own, although we specifically closed it each time. Yes, there could have been neighbors there, but why didn't they turn on the light? We checked. It worked. What was it? Mysticism or something explicable? You decide. But this still remains a mystery to me. My buddy's old house was haunted, and people would always hear footsteps and creaking floors, and they would see a black figure around the house. I didn't. One night we were all over, and my friend who lives in the house dared someone to go into the basement. Being the only one who didn't see Eshiti, I was fully willing to go to the basement. I got down there and waited for about 2 minutes. Then, when I was about to get out of the basement, I saw a shadow in the corner of my left eye. I snapped to my left and saw a large, dark figure. Not black. It seemed devoid of anything or any presence other than the cold that came over my body. As soon as I saw it, my hairs jumped to a stand on my neck. I froze, just staring at it. The feeling was surreal. I can't put it into words at all. Then, my heart pumped super fast, and my body got really warm. Everything just screamed danger in my head. So I turned to my right and ran towards the stairs. I looked for half a second back at it. It is now just a few feet away. That's when everything in my body went wild, and I just jumped up the stairs and ran up to the first floor where everyone was. I dropped behind the armchair, staring at the stairs. Everyone asked me what was wrong. I pointed and they finally looked and saw the thing on the stairs. We booked it towards the balcony and jumped into his backyard. We looked up, expecting to see it standing there, but nothing. Nothing was there. I lived in this fairly large house for about 10 years of my life. We had a very large basement in which my dad would tell me not to go down to basement at night, and when I would go during the daytime, someone else would come with. Now, as a child, my dad was the toughest guy I knew, and it seemed like nothing scared him at all, but I always questioned why, when he went downstairs to the basement, he brought our dog with him. It was about 2012, and I had a friend staying over like a sleepover. This friend decided to make a plan for us to go to my basement after my dad had said nobody can go to the basement. We waited for my dad and sisters to fall asleep, and we made our approach down to the basement. There were about 12 stairs or so down to the basement, and once you reached the basement, it was a cold, hard floor. We had brought flashlights just in case my dad woke up and went to the kitchen he wouldn't find any lights on. There are about 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and our laundry room down in the basement with a large area once you enter the basement. I was always told I couldn't enter these 2 rooms, which when I asked why, my dad just said, "'Cause there's glass in there." I ignored that fact and went into those rooms. My friend and I entered the first bedroom, and it was loaded with boxes and just storage stuff. Boring for some kids, so we go into the next room, and that's when things get a little bit weird. We enter the room just to hear weird noises, thinking it's my dad. We pause and wait for the noises to stop. The noises stop, and we head out of the room and go into the laundry room that also heads into the bathroom if you continue walking straight. I enter the bathroom and the mirror opens up, which I was not thinking, and just closed it. My friend tugs on my shirt, scaring the crap out of me, and tells me that he thinks my dad just walked down the stairs. I prepare myself to get scolded for not following rules, and I go, "Dad?" just for him not to be there. Thinking my friend is playing a trick on me, we hear more noises coming from that same second room we went into. I go in to check if it was my dad, but there was a door to the heater in there and it was open. I go to close it, and my friend said he had an odd feeling, so he stayed at the door to the room. I close the door and turn to see his face turn absolutely pale, and he's pointing right behind me. And I turn to see this black figure, and we both scream at the top of our lungs, sprinting to the staircase and up the stairs, my following behind him, and us hearing this figure sprint up the stairs towards us, and we reach the top and slam the door shut. With all the noise, we woke up my dad and told him what had happened. He told me he had called a friend to come over to hide in the basement to see if I would disobey his rules. 5 years go by, and my dad tells me that wasn't his friend, and the house was haunted, but he didn't want to scare me to the point where I didn't want to live there anymore.